Hello and thank you for joining us on this edition of Olsem Wanem. Public servants and families residing in most urban centers throughout the country have expressed dissatisfaction over the government's non-commitment to addressing the accumulating housing problems. They say the system has failed in delivering one vital human right, and that is a right to a home. It also seems to distance itself from eviction problems by failing to play a mediation role.
It's a problem, especially to find that most of the public servants tend to be seeking shelter in settlements and local villages due to the shortage of housing provided by the government and as well as the private sector. And I believe the government really has to look into providing homes for its workers.
With the increasing population of this country, and I think there's no control over population. All these things is contributing factor of the housing problem.
The main reasons I think is the higher cost of living in urban areas, which is greatly affecting and putting a strain on the income of the workers themselves.
The general consensus from the public resonates the same response across all sectors, informal and formal. The lack of proper housing facilities has affected service delivery from the workforce. Most public servants have had to put up with living with relatives or living in settlements due to the high rental cost and lack of housing alternatives here in the city. Public servants who live in government housing have had to live in deteriorating conditions for more than 10 years due to the lack of maintenance.
I have some close friends who work in Port Moresby in the public sector and the private sector who have seek shelter in the local villages, especially Hanwabara and Tatana, where they use the bottom, how should I put it, the bottom section of the home as their residing area and pay rent. But then they don't sign a formal form of agreement or contract to allow them to stay. And there's no proper arrangements being done. So whenever they have a little problem there, they just kick them out. But it's sometimes the fault of the visitors coming to visit the tenant or a local domestic dispute happening among the tenants, and they happen to push the blame down to the landlords, and then they push the blame down to the tenants and just kick them out.
Ino city to so live lo kada sentas inside lo PNG and people facing big issue lo housing.
For Hanobara village, it's 250 to 500 kina, around that range. Fortnightly, they have to pay. Whether you're an accountant or a cleaner or janitor or whatever, you still have to pay that rent in order to secure shelter.
All barracks they're run down, and then we need accommodation, urgent accommodation. At the moment, they're recruiting. There are no accommodations for the young ones coming out.
You're with Olsem Wanem. We'll be back with more after these short messages. The problem of housing has been ignored over the years by past governments, and in recent times, public servants were given 7 kina as housing allowance, but it's an amount that does not equate reality.
Workers get 7 kina to 300 kina housing allowance. A simple bed sitter would cost 250 kina per week. A 2 to 3 bedroom unit would cost almost 350 to 450 kina per week. And a house could cost from 500 kina to 650 kina per week, depending on the location.
Why would the government say that they have given housing allowance when it's only 7 kina? What would you do with 7 kina? 7 kina is not enough to pay for housing rent now in PNG. In Port Moresby, you are looking at about 1,000 up. There's no such thing as 7 kina.
Some of us, we are lucky to live in houses like that. Many officers, they live in the villages, they live in the settlement.
Only a few fortunate ones, they live in town with occupying government houses and all that.
I'm from West New Britain, and I'm talking especially like that's what's happening in West New Britain.
A lot of houses are run down.
I mean, I have staff who've had to leave reasonable housing and ended up in settlements because they can't afford it anymore. So government needs to address that. Many, many examples of being sold off illegally and not correctly, with some fairly, I think, ill-conceived schemes, the Morgan housing scheme, for example.
We would like to see that the standard housing policy for PNG citizens to cater for the growing population, maybe looking at 5-year plan. Also, if they can address the monitoring system, that we would like that to be put in place. Example, unemployed families of people still occupying government houses. Reinforcing the system, controlling the high inflation of housing rental rates throughout the country, especially the urban centers such as Port Moresby. We have business-minded people who are taking for granted in making money, and the government has no control over this matter, not even considering the low-class earners. Based on the high standard of living, maybe around 60% of the workers, both public servants, private sectors, that's including the NGOs, are living in the low-cost accommodation in the settlements.
Toilet pot belum mipla angga mapi go down. Samplata mipla go out na kam dolok. Mipla sa using easy access through asa mapla kain lik extra road belum mipla lo. Go through lo disla toilet ya na open him dotan. Suppose mo workman blo government. You employ mo lo sa workman blo government. Then you must look lo sit down belum mipla.
Sink clear la mipla wasing masante rubbish kana sa block lo here. And then mipla sa rouse samplata sa block mo pantana mipla sa rouse. It's the pipe and suck him out rubbish out.
You're watching Olsem Wanem. We'll have more after the break. You're watching Olsem Wanem. Rural to urban drift is one concern that has affected the housing situation as more and more people are venturing into the city to find a better life. The need for more houses increases.
Here, located inside the settlement, I'm not a workman. All come walking market, streets. Come na market, na go na walking pack inside settlement during being a background more settlements. So the best thing me work lulu is a councillor me look. I think all workman marry we all live lo settlement. Oh no, all workman merit as all by live and me right. All kind of all street vendors where usat work lo come sare mo kaikelo street na boy smoke na odesla. I think gaman blame me na lo movie mall outlots la country go on provinces all by your right. Lo desla way. I think city blow me by change and by clean. because me work close tab long time, 4 years, one time NCDC. Me na governor blow me spending more money on top of all this rubbish. Na, you know, Nablo city by trains. Because tin na mind blow or man. I mean a good plan. Still or go out in boy smoke law street. Na next day or next hour, next minute you look him or run him all or police run him all come back put him. Na make him more rubbish. The best thing gaman blow you me must look. Lord is la online. Especially our workman Mary must stop inside the city. Na law settlements.
Okay. It's also and another thing that the government seems to fail in doing is that we've signed conventions on the human rights, and how can you possibly say that we're living up to the conventions, or at least having signed up to those conventions? How can we possibly say that we're living up to them when we don't provide basic housing as a condition of employment? These are things that the government needs to take into account and consider in making up its plans for the future. If the urbanization workshop in the last few days highlighted that, you know, we're all looking like we're living in slums, what's the future for PNG? Are we going to continue living in settlements? Are we even for public servants and the general populace? We're probably going to be all living in villages if you think about it. But I think our government seriously needs to think about what the modern Papua New Guinea is going to look like. Are we going to be, if we're moving towards globalization, how can they possibly make sure that the living standards for PNG are better and that we meet the world standards in terms of our infrastructural development and economy?
We have towns that are almost suffocated by squatters and unplanned ad hoc development. Then we cannot be proud that of the place, of the towns and cities that we live in. And the fear is that if we let go of things the way we are going, there's no doubt about it that we will end up in very serious slum conditions. We're talking about 20, 30 years' time. What kind of towns and cities do we want? That's the question we are asking at this forum. Or should we do something better? Should we pay attention to it? Should we design our towns and cities? Or should we allow them to grow by default? Let them grow the way they want. Let them develop the way they want. Just like we have allowed it to develop and evolve by themselves over the last 37 years. I don't think we should do that. I believe, in my office, and we believe that we should stop, put the brakes on, and turn a different direction.
This is Olsem Wanem. We'll be back after the short break.
Suppose you get goal and look on actually blah. Oh, me stop never happen to them. Me time stop our movement local me bam. But talk eviction so time our come rush me bam and demolition or just come run over house plan. Me don't even pack up yet to talking about come moving something plan.
Kalau tu stop na, polis karo kandon. Kam no kol burga mo lau samlau so tramo solwara. Burga si kam Nolan lo tutu kamo chiro waran go santim blo go gotau semburuk o tala move kolo side sowara no sleep
on no kam tok sabe kam Mibla just stop chol na watch him all machines come, broke him down house dumpla.
Most people are unaware of their rights to a home, so we spoke to the United Nations Office of the High Commission for Human Rights to explain further.
Another grave violation of housing rights is forced evictions. And that's something that we've been working on now for the last 3.5 years here in Papua New Guinea. And it concerns not just people living in Port Moresby, but also across the nation, up in the highlands, Murray province. So around the country, a lot of people are facing problems with housing. And the right to housing includes that it should be an affordable house, and the increase in discrepancy between what people are earning and the cost of living is causing real hardship for people in Papua New Guinea, and particularly for those who are already vulnerable and marginalized and discriminated against. So the UN has focused particularly on people living in settlements, because we believe in the urban areas that they're the ones who are in greatest need of support. They're often victim of different forms of human rights violations, so already the right to adequate housing, which should include sanitation, electricity, basic services, is not provided to people living in settlements. They don't have security. By that I mean they don't have security of tenure, so they don't actually have a feeling of security that they will be able to remain and build their lives in the settlement. But on top of that, something which I think is perhaps more worrisome is that they don't have physical security. So if something happens in a settlement, there's no one to call on. The police very rarely would come into the settlement to investigate crimes that happen here. Often victims, whether they are men, women or children, are left to their own devices to try and seek justice. And there are many, many obstacles to seeking justice in this country if you are from a very marginalized group, like people living in settlements. So the UN is here really to support community leaders working for the rights of their communities, together with NGOs and other stakeholders, and particularly government, to encourage them to think more carefully about the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups in society, and to provide them with the basic rights that they have, which includes service provision. I'd like perhaps to talk a little bit about forced evictions.
And I have 10 Tugula and 8 children. And just don't know where to go now.
Supposed to be a court order, but there was no evidence here, no proof.
Because under international human rights law, you can be evicted lawfully. That can happen, but it has to be done according to certain procedures, and it has to be done in consultation with community leaders, and there has to be a plan for relocation. So that's something that we're looking at, and are quite concerned because it doesn't happen that way, or not very often here in Papua New Guinea. So I think a lot can be done, and I think a great starting point is to talk to the communities concerned. They need to be part of the solution. There's a lot of very smart people living in communities in settlements, and they have fantastic ideas about how these problems which Papua New Guinea is facing with regards to rural to urban drift can be resolved. So that's what I would encourage people to do, to get out, talk to communities, find out what their ideas are for solving some of the big problems that you have in Papua New Guinea with regards to inequalities, discrimination, human rights violations, and making sure that the wealth is distributed more equally. And especially those right at the bottom who are living in poverty are helped first, because if we help develop their lives and give them hope for a better future, then it's going to be a fantastic Papua New Guinea for everybody.
Well, that's the end of our program, and as always, you are welcome to comment on the program via the address on your screen, or view the full episode on our website, which is www.mtvonline.com. Thank you for your company. We'll see you again next time on Olsem Wanem.